Hi, you guys. Welcome back to History of Thought 2. And today we're going to be talking about Edward Said and his idea of Orientalism. So, building upon our last discussion of Foucault, Edward Said is explicitly sort of applying Foucault's idea of power. And power is sort of this disciplinary power. This kind of power is being bound up inexplicably with knowledge, this kind of capillary model of power, and the importance of disciplinary over sovereign power in the contemporary era. But he's looking at a different, let's say, area than Foucault is. Said is looking at how colonialism and imperialism were upheld and justified, and how sort of neo-imperialism is today, not just through physical strength, military strength, through force, but through the circulation of a system of ideas about other peoples, about the peoples that the West was encountering and colonizing and engaging in sort of imperialist activities in. So the first thing that I like to do when talking about this class or talking about this topic, because Said's book is called Orientalism. And, when we hear the word Orient, what do we imagine? It's kind of this old-fashioned, slightly offensive word now, right? Like maybe there's still some places called Oriental restaurants. Maybe that's what my grandma would call a Chinese restaurant. But it's used for centuries in Western cultures to describe certain places. But I want to, originally in its medieval usage, the Orient refers to the East. Right? The Occident is the West and the Orient is the East. But the question is, whose East did this Orient represent? East of where? So, think about looking at this map. Where exactly would the Orient be? Oh, show myself. Where exactly would the Orient be here? Orient, we kind of think east, but east of where? What's sort of centered on this map? I mean, think about how this map is centered on Europe as is sort of the common, any kind of common representation of a world map. So, the east geographically could be Eastern Europe, it could be Russia, it could be, Iran, Kazakhstan, China, Mongolia, India, right? That's sort of east, although some of those areas are also south, right? So, what's interesting about the idea of the Orient is that it's not really describing in any kind of accuracy a specific geographic space. It's more of what is imagined, a space that is imagined. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Orient Express train. There's a famous Agatha Christie mystery, Murder on the Orient Express. Where did the Orient Express go? It went from Vienna, which is in Austria, kind of in Central Europe, to Istanbul, which is in Turkey. So just across where Europe ends and Asia begins. So again, it's kind of this imaginative space of cultures other than European cultures that, had been encountered for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They encountered each other. So, when Europeans talk about, when Westerners historically talk about the Orient, it can apply to the Middle East and even North Africa, even though that's South. It can apply to South Asia. It can apply to East Asia, Southeast Asia. It's this very broad kind of concept. It's not about where the East and Eastern cultures are, it's where we imagine them to be. And where are they now? Where do we imagine the East and Eastern cultures? And how do we imagine them? I think now sort of our locus of interest is really fixated in China because of sort of global political issues. But really the point is that it isn't a real description of a real place, but it's how a particular space is imagined. So I think a concept that wasn't in your guys' excerpt from Orientalism, but is in, I think, the next chapter that after the one I assigned, but I think this is an important concept that helps you understand this sort of imagining of the Orient, is Said's concept of imaginative geography. And this is what he says in the book. He says, it is perfectly possible to argue that some distinctive objects are made by the mind, and that these objects, while appearing to exist objectively, have only a fictional reality. A group of people living on a few acres of land will set up boundaries between their land and its immediate surroundings and the territory beyond, which they call the land of the barbarians. In other words, this universal practice of designating in one's mind a familiar space which is ours and an unfamiliar space beyond ours which is theirs is a way of making geographical distinctions that can be entirely arbitrary. I use the word arbitrary here because imaginative geography of the our land barbarian land variety does not require that the barbarians acknowledge the distinction. It is enough for us to set up these boundaries in our own minds. They become they accordingly, and both their territory and their mentality are designated as different from ours. To a certain extent, modern and primitive societies seem thus to derive a sense of their identities negatively. A 5th century Athenian was very likely to feel himself to be non-barbarian, as much as he positively felt himself to be Athenian. The geographic boundaries accompany the social, ethnic, and cultural ones in expected ways, yet often the sense in which someone feels himself to be not foreign is based on a very unrigorous idea about what is out there beyond one's own territory. All kinds of suppositions, associations, and fictions appear to crowd the unfamiliar space outside one's own. So this really kind of brings us back to that self-other dynamic, that understandings of the other, and we've talked about it kind of in individual identity politics, right? About gender, about race, but we can think about this in terms of nations, in terms of cultures, in terms of civilizations. That our understandings of the other, that other culture, that group of people, those barbarians, those people who are different than us, it's really not about sort of a true or accurate description or understanding of their culture. It's really about how we imagine ourselves and how we imagine ourselves to not be. But the interesting part about Orientalism is kind of this question is, do our understandings of the other have to be overtly negative, right? Do they all have to be like, ooh, those terrible barbarians? Are there things about the other that are also kind of desirable? Maybe things that are taboo in our culture that we criticize in theirs, but we secretly kind of desire. What are the things that we fantasize about and long for? What are the desirable and undesirable aspects of the other? And are both kinds of stereotypes equally negative? So you're going to see a really interesting mix of how the Orient as this other vis-a-vis the West is defined, this sort of mix of sort of fantasy and denigration kind of all wrapped up into one. So we can ask, in contemporary times, this is something, we can think about in class, who is they, other, not us for contemporary America? So, I think an obvious one since 9/11, going back even farther of the past couple decades, obviously is the terrorist, is the figure of somebody wearing a burqa or a niqab, right? Like, the sort of war against Western civilization purportedly being carried out by sort of radical Islamic terrorists, which, that definitely is sort of something that we define ourselves vis-a-vis against. And, often in sort of the discourse and the way that it's talked about, it's literally a clash of civilizations. And interestingly enough, it picks up some of the older stereotypes about the Orient, about the spaces of the Middle East part of the Orient that Said is looking at, but they're also different. They're kind of different as well. I think a newer manifestation of this would be with the current coronavirus pandemic, the idea of the China or Wuhan virus. So you can see I have a tweet from Donald Trump, November 16th, 2020, where he refers to it as the China plague. And of course, we know, him and other politicians that agree with him have also called it the China plague, the China virus, the Wuhan plague, right? And, there's some really interesting parallels to this in kind of late 1800s, early 1900s fears in the US about the yellow peril and these undifferentiated masses of Asians bringing disease to the US. So these are new ideas, but they're also drawing on old ideas. And they're also drawing on these stereotypes about this Eastern other, this Chinese other. Right. So this is really in a lot of ways about the power of language and the power of discourse, right? Foucault. Okay. And it's also about what are the qualities of these others that are not us? And how does this define us? I mean, what is it supposed to be saying about America to call it the Chinese virus? The fact that we're healthy, we're not diseased. We're not, these overcrowded masses of undifferentiated people where disease spreads rapidly, right? We don't have, like these filthy wet markets. Now, I'm using hyperbolic language on purpose here. And you can even see some sort of discourse about sort of freedom-loving democracy, the fact that we sort of see ourselves as being open and having liberty and all these things. And part of the reason that the virus develops in China from this particular discourse is secrecy and closed offness, as well as this sort of autocratic state. So I'm not saying any of this is true, obviously, but you can see how the story develops and what it's really trying to say about America and defining America and in a way displacing blame, right? Displacing blame also, trying to sort of get out of taking any kind of responsibility for mishandling the virus or for allowing people in America to die because of policy mistakes, right? It's China's fault, not us. We're not culpable. We're not guilty, right? So Edward Said was a well-known literary theorist, cultural critic, and a very well-known sort of public intellectual in America in the 70s and 80s up till his death in 2003. He had a very multicultural life. So we call him a Palestinian Lebanese American. He was actually born in, it was not Israel at the time. It was that wasn't until after World War II, but it was Palestine. It was a British protectorate in the Middle East. So Said's father was what today we would call Palestinian. He was sort of from Palestine ethnically. His mother was Lebanese. But they actually both were Arab Christians. So they both practiced Protestant Christianity. Yes, there are Christians in the Middle East, but his father had like a lot of interactions with Americans during World War I, so he kind of passed on this positive view of Americans. His family actually moved to Egypt when he was younger, and he was educated in Egypt, in Cairo, and went to, though, kind of a British school in Cairo. So he, this would have been like a school modeled on kind of the British education system. So, he would have been educated in kind of the 40s and 50s in this very sort of classic British schoolboy education. But living in Egypt, in Cairo, as an Arab Christian of Palestinian and Lebanese descent. So a very kind of complicated and intercultural background. He comes to America for his postgraduate studies. So, he becomes an American academic at Harvard and at Columbia. And he actually, throughout a lot of his career, was a very strong Palestinian activist, especially at a time in the 80s and 90s when it wasn't very popular to do that. That is something, it's still quite controversial, right? Like with the BDS movement, but he was sort of being involved in sort of Palestinian advocacy before the left had really picked up on it as a major issue. So Said's area of study was actually comparative literature. Originally with his sort of British secondary school education and his American academic education, he was really looking at he really studied kind of classic English literature. But, as his career goes on, he becomes interested in sort of British literature and sort of broadly more Western literature in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, how the areas of the Middle East and sort of the Orient more broadly, how they are represented, how they are constructed, how are they conceived in literature and other kinds of not just literature, but in art and political documents and travel writing, all this kind of stuff. And so this leads to probably his most famous book of all, Orientalism, which he publishes in 1978. So before I tell you what Orientalism is and what the term means, I'm going to tell you what it is not. And these are some of the common misconceptions. Orientalism is not a description for every stereotype, every misperception, every myth, etc., that people in the West have had about people's societies, cultures, etc., of the inhabitants of sort of the Middle East and the East. Okay? So sometimes the word kind of now gets tossed around. Oh, that's a very Orientalist depiction or Orientalist trope. I mean, I think now it kind of has become like this synonym for a stereotype about people in Asia or the Middle East. But he's making a much more specific argument. This term gets used a little bit too sloppily nowadays in popular media and even academia. So let's try to tease apart what it actually is, the political work that Orientalism is doing, and how it still operates today. So today, for this lecture, we're going to try to figure out what Orientalism is through examples, first through art, then Said's own words, and then we're going to look at how these Orientalist ideas get produced and criticized. And Orientalism, in this sense, is a discourse, how Foucault uses it, a regime of truth, right? So the power of how you define things, how you categorize things, how you gain knowledge about things, how you create knowledge, what knowledge is created about that thing, the Orient. How it influences our current understandings of the East, is something that we can, I'll talk about a little end here, but we can talk about more in class. So we can draw links between the 18th and 19th century concepts of, quote, the Orient and representations of the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia today. Our current understandings of the East or the Middle East are still interpreted through this history of Orientalism. So at the end, we can kind of think about how does Orientalism still circulate today and why? And also kind of what's the line between appreciating and being influenced by other cultures versus cultural appropriation or just pure cultural misrepresentation. So we're going to be looking at some paintings. And there is actually a genre of painting in the West called Orientalism, from sort of the mostly 1800s, some in the 1700s, mostly 1800s, sometime into the early 1900s. And Said sort of uses this genre of paintings and its name, Orientalism, as a way to understand this set of stereotypes that are being constructed. So, if this was live in class, we'd stop at each painting and talk about it. I'll say a few words about each, but we're going to go through them kind of a little more quickly than we would in a live class. But I want you to think about sort of what's the discourse that's being created about this space of the Orient. Where is it? Who inhabits it? What is this culture like? What are these people like? What are their values? And finally, what is this all saying about the West? All these spaces of not West. Okay. So this is one of the more famous ones. This actually is the cover. Oh, crap. There we go. This is actually the cover for, I think, one of the main editions of Said's book, Orientalism. So this is Jean-Léon Gérôme, The Snake Charmer, 1879. Gérôme is a French painter, right? So, think about what we see here, the snake charmer. So you kind of have this big sort of interior space. It's kind of unclear if it's interior, exterior, if it's public, private, but probably, somebody against the background. The man that's kind of sitting up high is somebody of importance, right? But, he has a number of people in his entourage. But how are they all positioned? Right? They're not kind of sitting at attention. They're all sort of lounging. There's kind of a laziness about all of this, right? Kind of, we're all just sort of, you see this in a lot of Oriental Spain, we're all just sort of lounging around, doing nothing, sometimes smoking hookah. And then you can see the snake charmer. And it's always kind of a question, who's the snake charmer? Is it the old man with sort of the flute? Or is it the youth, the juvenile, possibly a boy, uncertain, who has the snake around him? But what is this picture trying to say about this scene, about this place, right? It's sort of exotic. It's kind of exciting, but the people are all kind of like maybe a little lazy, lounging around. It might be a little sort of decadent, and it's also a little sort of, even we could say in the language of the time, sort of sexually questionable. Why is this youth naked? There's something that's just, this is not us. But it isn't like this, oh, look how terrible this is. It's kind of that, but it's also kind of titillating. Like, what's going on here? This is Eugène Delacroix, The Women of Algiers, 1834. And think about, who are these women? And what are they doing? And what kind of space are they inhabiting? And this is kind of a private interior space, right, where women often inhabit, or at least that's how it's being imagined. And they're all kind of lounging around again. You see the hookah, they're smoking hookah. Their shoes are off. They're kind of in these, their bodies are sort of positioned in these sort of, a little bit, the figure on the left, a little bit suggestively. You have the dark-skinned woman standing on the right. Is she one of them? Is she one of the women? Is she a servant? How would we read her? But that indeterminacy also is kind of suggestive as well. Think about a lot of the strict racial hierarchies the Enlightenment was, Enlightenment thinkers were endorsing. And in the Orient, or in Algiers, right, you have these spaces of sort of racial mixing, which is actually true to places like North Africa. You have lots of people of a variety of skin tones in North African societies. But, there's something kind of transgressive about that. And, the question is, can we imagine that she's a servant? Okay, so she's staying with the norms of how things should be, right? Or is she also one of the women of Algiers? And I'll also say, too, that that to a European viewer in 1834, this also would have suggested a harem or sex workers, right? And so then that sort of racial diversity element, if that's true, becomes even more sort of forbidden. And remember, the forbidden is something we can both condemn, but also something we secretly desire. Oh, and again, too, sort of notice the lounging. It's not on chairs, right? It's on the floor, on carpets. There's blankets, right? There's kind of this sense of slightly uncivilizedness with that. This is Giulio Rosati's inspection of the new arrivals. It's undated, but it's sometime in the late 1800s. Again, we have these kind of open spaces, but they're interior courtyard spaces. So they're sort of open and airy, but they're private spaces. So we're peeking into these private spaces of Oriental life. And we're not really sure where this is, right? It's unclear, but it doesn't really matter about when we imagine the Orient. It really isn't about, this is a specific space. This is this particular town or this guy's palace. And what do we imagine taking place here? The inspection of the new arrivals, right? Again, we have people sort of lounging on the floor, laying on carpets. I think you can see maybe a hookah somewhere in the background. And it's, this partially clothed women. And then this one woman who's standing there nude, kind of looking a little demure or shy. And then the one man sort of facing her is, I guess, supposed to be inspecting her. And so what do we imagine? right? She's the new member of the harem. And think about the ideal of the harem, right? The ideal of sort of one man having this kind of stable of women and this kind of pick of and the Western imagination of it, right? The sexual access to these multiple women. And how, in the Western imagination, that's both sort of barbaric, it's both immoral, but it's also kind of titillating, right? Especially for kind of a straight male gaze. This is Jerome again, heads of the rebel beys at the Mosque of El Hassanain in Cairo, 1866. So again, we kind of have like the lounging again. I mean, nobody's like standing in attention or, in any kind of an Orientalist painting in sort of an active kind of position, right? There's pipe smoking. If you just look at the two figures, it's just kind of like two guys, maybe a guard because he has a big knife, but they're kind of hanging out, especially the one guy on the left. But what makes this particularly interesting is the decapitated heads. He's just sort of casually sitting next to, and the heads hanging from the top. And you can kind of also see inside the interior, again, one of these kinds of open, large private spaces. So we're kind of invited to take a look, right in the center of the painting in that kind of orangey bright color. We want to take a look and we're invited to walk into that private space. Maybe that's where the harem is. We have to go over the heads, right? But what is that saying? Right? I mean, this is really about barbarism. This is about, it's about a disorderly, sometimes violent culture. But we don't see actively people engaged in violence in a lot of these paintings. We just see sort of the aftermath. So you can both uphold the idea of a violent culture, but also kind of a lazy culture. This is David Roberts, the Hypaethral Temple of Philae, 1838. This one's a little different, right? This is ruins. And you see kind of a lot of pictures at this time period in the 1800s in European art of like classical ruins. And not just ruins of Europe, not just like ancient Rome, ancient Greece, right? And this could be maybe, it's unclear, maybe ancient Rome, but remember Rome was all across the entire Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, right? The Roman Empire. It's kind of uncertain where this is. You see some contemporary people on boats, you see some figures, by the temple, but it's a ruined temple, right? There was once a great civilization here who made this, but it's now in ruin. So, some of these visions of the Orient, it isn't the same as sort of the Western othering of like indigenous peoples in the Americas or sub-Saharan African peoples, which is just like an othering that is based on idea of just pure primitivism. This is working a little different. This othering, it's almost about decaying cultures that were once great civilizations, but have decayed partially into barbarism. And the ruins kind of, they're very romantic, but the ruins also kind of other that culture in a way, saying, well, you were once great, but not anymore. This is John Joseph Benjamin Constance, a day after the victory at the Alhambra, 1882, right? So we can imagine this is, you see kind of this entourage coming in, the day after this great victory, and you kind of see the aftermath of the victory party, right? Everybody kind of laying around on the ground, partially disrobed, covering up, right? So, oh, we won, let's celebrate. And this kind of like hedonistic, almost like an orgy, right? And again, similar to some of the other paintings, there is a diversity of skin color, right? So that's something that would have been seen as kind of othered in the West, right? The fact that Oriental cultures, especially sort of North African, Middle Eastern cultures, there aren't these kinds of racial hierarchies the same way they operate in the West. Kind of the kind of sort of sexual, what would have been seen as sexual perversity, kind of oversexed, overindulgent in sort of sexual pleasures, even like taboo sexual pleasures. That's something that's very much part of this image. I like this one though, because I don't know if anyone knows where the Alhambra is. It's in Spain. It's in Granada. And this is also a reminder, right, that there are portions of Europe at different times, that can kind of be othered in this way too. There was, in European Middle Ages, there was an Islamic empire that covered large portions of sort of the Mediterranean in the same way the Roman Empire had, centuries before. And it included large parts of Spain, and there were, a considerable portion of time where parts of Spain were sort of a cultural capital of this very sort of ethnically, religiously, culturally diverse Muslim empire. Of course, that's not necessarily being represented here as like a positive thing. It's almost sort of decadent. Last one. I think this is the last one. Hold on. Yes, last one. This is Leon. I'm never going to remember how you pronounce this guy's name in French. Cognier, the 1798 Egyptian expedition under the command of Bonaparte. Now, I put this here to remind you that, these aren't just stereotypes that Europeans are coming up with about peoples that they had only just recently encountered. There's long-standing sense of relationships between sort of Europe and North Africa and the Middle East, and even South Asia and East Asia, long-standing trading relationships. Napoleon Bonaparte in 1789 actually goes into Egypt to conquer it. And throughout a lot of the 1800s, right, the French and the British are both, and into the 1900s, are sort of, acting in sort of imperialist ways in Egypt. And all over sort of the Mediterranean basin, there have been various kinds of conquests by Europeans into those areas and by sort of North African Middle Easterners into Europe. So these are long-standing relationships. In some way, sort of North Africa and the Middle East is the part of the Orient that they're very familiar with and sort of fascinated with, but also kind of disparaging about. While kind of the farther afield you get to Europe, sort of South Asia, East Asia, that's kind of the mysterious Orient, the less known other. But, again, we see also this kind of idea of easily conquerable people. While they may be disorderly and sometimes violent and barbaric, as the chopped off heads picture shows, they're also kind of like they lounge about all the time and smoke hookah, right? They're easily conquerable. So, think about if you were going to, like what we did with madness in the Foucault discussion, if we were just sort of to write up a list of descriptions and terms that could kind of encapsulate the pictures that you saw, exotic, far away, dangerous, maybe, exciting, sexually perverse, but also kind of titillating. The people are snake charmers, carpet vendors, veiled women, harems, harassing merchants, belly dancers, sheiks, despotic rulers, the spaces of chaotic markets, decadent palaces, enclosed harems, public laziness. Sort of a sense of passiveness, a sense of sort of being sexualized, a sense of like deception, manipulation, disorderly, sometimes violent. Visions of a decaying mythic East, right? Like once these civilizations were great, but also kind of this controllable, conquerable people, but also unchanging, at least in kind of contemporary times, unchanging static cultures, which can be more easily studied, depicted, and analyzed and controlled. Alluring and repulsive at the same time. I mean, you can imagine sort of this other as both we're sort of critiquing their decadence and their perversity and their laziness, and the fact that they sort of were once great and became more barbaric. But there's also sort of a pleasure in imagining yourself in those spaces, right? Definitely. But versus, what's the image of the West that's being constructed as more developed, as more rational, as more flexible, as more advanced, as superior. So, what exactly is Orientalism? So, Orientalism, think of it as a lens through which Westerners view Eastern culture. It's like a set of glasses. But it's really a system of knowledge produced by the West, circulated by the West, about the Orient, about the East. It's a discourse. It's a Foucauldian, what Foucault calls a discourse. Like he looks at discourse. Foucault looks at discourses about crime and punishment, about medicine, about madness, about sexuality. And Said is using sort of that approach to look at the discourse about Orientalism. Orientalism's power is through how it constructs knowledge about this object called the Orient. Now, this object, the Orient, doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. I mean, there's actual real peoples and cultures and nations and all that kind of stuff within these areas, right? But the idea of the Orient, it's imagined geography, right? But we create this thing called the Orient in the West, and then we construct knowledge about it. But again, it's really about the West trying to construct its own identity and, again, vis-a-vis the Orient, and really nothing about what these cultures are really like. It's a fantasy, but it's a purposeful fantasy. So Said says Orientalism is, quote, a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in European Western experience. The Orient is not only adjacent to Europe, it is also the place of Europe's greatest and richest and oldest colonies. It is the source of its civilizations and languages, its cultural contestant, and one of its deepest and most reoccurring images of the other. So that is really kind of talking about like North Africa, Middle East. But there's a lot of Orientalism and Orientalist discourse, which is also about sort of further afield, which is about South Asia, like the Indian subcontinent, or about China. And a lot of Orientalist discourse nowadays is really about China. So Said also says, quote, taking the late 18th century as a very roughly defined starting point, Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it, teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. I found it useful here to employ Foucault's notion of a discourse to identify Orientalism. My contention is without examining Orientalism as a discourse, one cannot possibly understand the enormously systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient, politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively during the post-Enlightenment period. As Said goes on to say, European culture gained strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and even underground self. What does that mean, underground self? Think about that. As a surrogate and an underground self. Sometimes, and I've mentioned this before, sometimes those aspects of the other, if you're defining the self, I'm definitely not that. Sometimes it's also about like the secret desire for those things, right? That we're not supposed to have. So it's about sort of that interplay between kind of repulsion and desire. Sometimes the things that we're most critical of are the things that we also secretly desire. I mean, maybe people in Europe in the 1800s really wanted to lay around and smoke hookah and hang out in harems. But that really wasn't part of the Enlightenment sort of rational project of applying science to the world to make it better and achieve progress, right? So what are some of the specific sources of this Orientalist discourse? How do ideas get produced and circulated according to Said? And who creates and recreates these ideas? Academics, colonial administrators, policy experts, artists, poets, writers. So that was actually one of your reading questions, but we'll be talking about it in a little detail here. let's see. So I'm going to hide myself. So one big area is art and literature. So Western artists, writers, adventurers, and tourists actually do travel to the Middle East and North Africa and Asia, and they produce paintings and poetry and novels and travelogues and other stories about these cultures and regions, right? This is popular culture at the time. Although a lot of the artists and writers never actually visited these spaces, but they're still producing work about them and their fantasies about what they're like. You know, it's interesting. I mean, I guess the question is, does it matter if the artist or the writer or whomever actually visited that space or not? I mean, it can. But you can still construct the fantasy of that space and the Western sort of projection of that space, even if you actually physically went there, because your visit will already be colored by that Orientalist framework. You're only going to see what you think you know, right? It's also about official political and academic sources for Said. You know, this is in the middle of colonialism and imperialism. So you have the works of politicians, policy experts, colonial administrators, soldiers, academics, right? This is when anthropology is being developed as a discipline. You know, also producing reports and policy briefings and diaries and scholarly books and research about the Orient. And you have the circulation of Orientalism in European mass culture. So in the West, especially in Europe, you have sort of fashion, trends in fashion and decorating for consuming, quote, Oriental objects like porcelain, textile, fashion, carpets from the Middle East and Asia. For instance, chinoiserie was a trend of supposedly Chinese-inspired decorative arts, and the ability of Europeans to produce and own these materials to some extent kind of confirmed their imperial influence in these areas. And, you know, at this time, you also have world's fairs and cultural national pavilions at world's fairs, which are primarily taking place in the West, which are sort of, you know, like showing you, oh, look at all of these exotic world cultures, but they're also kind of supporting the idea of colonial expansion, right? Look at these exotic cultures, and these are also people we have to civilize. So like the decorative arts, they're fostering the notion of the Orient as a fantasy to be consumed and controlled. So, switch to myself. So Orientalism, as we said, it's a discourse. And Foucault's, just to remind you, Foucault's sort of use or definition of a discourse is systems of thought composed of ideas, attitudes, courses of action, beliefs, and practices that systematically construct the subjects in the worlds of which they speak. So it's about sort of a system of how you define things, how you categorize things, and what things' relationship are. System of ideas that we often see as natural and take for granted. And, you know, instead of discourse, you can kind of think discursive system. And Foucault says a discursive system produces a regime of truth in a given era, in a given area. Right? So, you know, this is really for Foucault and for Said, the importance of the interrelationship between power, disciplinary power, and knowledge. So a lot of what Foucault is looking at is about how things like the abnormal normal get created and reinforced, you know, in psychiatry, in medicine, in criminal justice systems, and sexuality. For Said, it's about how East-West distinction gets created and reinforced, which is really about sort of reinforcing the West sort of domination. So in a way, it's kind of using discourse and discourse and disciplinary power to sort of reinforce the West's use of sovereign power through colonialism. And this is very much about kind of this self-other dynamic. So, I was going to say the capillary like circulation of power. So Orientalist ideas, right? It isn't like, I mean, there is, you know, there is a military presence literally like invading these peoples, right? That's very top-down sovereign power. But if you think about how all of these things get circulated and produced, it's through like books and art and reports and travel logs and all of these, you know, things that sort of circulate at the low level and sort of work their way, you know, sort of gather up and sort of create these images from the ground up. And again, this is really about the self-other dynamic. The West-East is the self-other, And, again, it isn't about the West defining and constructing the Orient. It's how the Orient plays this instrumental role in the construction of European or Western culture. The West controls and authorizes views about the East. But we can ask, to what ends? What are the political effects of an Orientalist discourse? They help justify colonialism and imperialism. They help justify the idea of, quote, the civilizing mission. They help justify subjugation and control of the other, justified not just militarily, but intellectually and culturally. So Said says in Orientalism that, quote, Orientalism is not a mere political subject matter or a field that is reflected passively by culture, scholarship, or institutions, nor is it a large and diffuse collection of texts about the Orient, nor is it representative and expressive of some nefarious Western imperialist plot to hold down the Oriental world. Rather, it is a distribution of geopolitical awareness into aesthetic, scholarly, economic, sociological, historical, and philological texts. It is rather than expresses a certain will or intention to understand, in some cases to control, to manipulate, even to incorporate what is manifestly different or alternative and novel in the world. It is above all a discourse that is by no means in direct corresponding relationship with political power in the raw, but rather is produced and exists in uneven exchange with various kinds of power, shaped to a degree by the exchange with power, political, intellectual, cultural, and moral. So again, right, that isn't like some, person at the head of the let's construct Orientalist office, somewhere in Europe, like we're going to come up with all these constructions, right? This is, things that sort of emerge, I don't want to say organically, but they emerge, through colonial encounters, but they emerge sort of the ground up as Europeans are sort of attempting to define themselves vis-a-vis these cultures that they are encountering. And I think one thing that we can ask is, what about today? What are these representations today? Think about when we talked about madness and Foucault's argument about how there used to be a different discourse about madness, right? So we used to think, like the moon caused people to be crazy, or demons, or that, crazy people could, and I use that, could speak truth to power, and, before the medicalization of mental illness, and even the very term mental illness is a medicalization. So, that still kind of makes sense to us. I mean, we may not agree with it, but some of these previous discourses, you still see traces of them in contemporary discourse. So the question is, are all of these ideas about Orientalism that you saw in the paintings, these sort of stereotypes about these cultures, do we still see traces of that today? Or have new sets of stereotypes sort of emerged with shifting changes in geopolitical reality? Or kind of both, right? I mean, if the Orientalist stereotype still makes sense to us, it means they're still kind of here, although maybe they've morphed and transitioned. And that's what discourse does. I mean, that's kind of that capillary notion of how things change. It isn't like just this one big, some sovereign power says, we're going to think about the Orient this way now, right? It sort of happens gradually. These shifts occur through how these representations on the ground change and circulate. So Orientalism today, this could be like a whole semester. We can talk about how these older views of the Orient from the West affect our understanding of the peoples and cultures of the East today. And what are some of the new stereotypes and fantasies about people and places in the East? When we do the live class, I often will have you watch Cardi B's 2017 video, Bodak Yellow. There's a image from a Rihanna video on this slide, I think from Princess of China, which was a few years before that. I think, the image on the upper right-hand corner is, of course, the Marvel movie Doctor Strange, which uses a lot of sort of Eastern imagery. And I have, in the upper left-hand, kind of what I would call Orientalist or chinoiserie kind of decor. And then what about sort of the sort of growing popularity of, Eastern religions like Buddhism and meditation, even sort of meditation in a secular sense. I mean, maybe this isn't like a nasty racist stereotype, but what does it say about the way that we imagine Eastern cultures and how we engage with things like meditation? Right? Oh, there's some sort of deeper wisdom that we can find in Eastern religions that is absent from Western. That itself is sort of part of a discourse, right? What remains the same in all of this, in the 1800s Orientalist painting and in sort of all of this today, is that there is a discourse, there's a regime of truth that the West constructs about the East that has political implications and ultimately is about the construction of Western identity. It's us versus them. And maybe it's civilization barbarian, but maybe that's shifted a little bit too. The content of the stereotypes, the labels, the fantasies, the myths may shift, alter, and even change. But the process of how they get constructed and circulate within the West kind of stays the same, right? So art and literature, political and news reports, mass culture. So the forms have changed. I mean, think about today, right? The importance of film, the importance of music videos, all this kind of stuff as opposed to the 1800s. Today we often think of Orientalism more broadly as the West's sort of selective seeing of the East. And this selective seeing, this lens, includes exotification, kind of condescending, a condescending attitude, appropriation, but definitely a lot of othering. Distinctive aspects of particular cultures get glommed together in a blurry whole, right? And you see that, and you'll see if you watch the Rihanna Princess of China video or the Cardi B Bodak Yellow video, you'll really see that. Easternness, Indianness, Asianness, etc. Almost like a department store of culture where we can pick and choose what we are and are not interested in buying. I'll take a little bit of Chineseness over there and some Indianness over here, and then, So what's the difference? I guess, a lot of this today is about consumption. It's about media consumption. It's also about like decoration. It's about dress, makeup, this kind of stuff. So, one thing that we can talk about in class is what's the difference between cultural appreciation and influence versus cultural appropriation. Is prejudice only about sort of hatred and seemingly negative stereotypes? What about these neutral or even positive fantasies about Oriental spaces being created and consumed? A taste, a fondness, or even a fetish for certain people or a culture that is a fantasy. Is this appropriation? Is this kind of negative parts of a larger discourse? Any representation by the dominant of the less powerful, no matter how well-intentioned, will always do some violence to the culture of the other. You cannot escape some level of stereotyping and appropriation. That's just part of it. But, it's kind of interesting nowadays, especially think of like an America versus China kind of dynamic. Who's the dominant one? And also, interestingly enough, this is a whole other set of topics, but one if you want to explore. What are the cultural fantasies? What are the sort of discourses that you have in spaces in the Orient? So like that you have in China, what are the fantasies about the West? Occidentalism. I know this is a long one, but hopefully it was, helpful in understanding Said and Orientalism and maybe even Foucault and the idea of discourse a little bit more. So see you guys in class.